Welcome to the second in our Europe since COVID series. This is a university study group that is hosted also and co-sponsored by the Illiberalism Studies program at the IRIS of the Elliott School for International Affairs at George Washington University. Today, we're going to be examining how the far right in Europe has been faring since the onset of the COVID-19 epidemic. The pandemic sent shockwaves throughout the European democracies, and we thought that we should think a little bit about how this has affected the fortunes of the extreme right for a number of reasons. One is that the pandemic led to the closure of a lot of borders, and so migration sort of fell, it fell numerically and fell off of the political agenda, so that during the German elections that just took place, the Alternativen für Deutschland did not gain a lot of seats, except in some of the Eastern Länder states. So it looked like perhaps that the far right wasn't taking advantage of the pandemic. But in fact, what's happened is that in the meantime in Germany, there's been a backlash against mandatory quarantines and against vaccine and mask mandates, so much so that there were big demonstrations around the Reichstag that were reminiscent of the January 9th insurrection in the United States. So clearly the far right has not gone away. It just seems to have been influenced by insecurities and anger over the pandemic. And so it sort of shape-shifted a bit. We also know that in France, Marine Le Pen is contending for the presidency, and there will be a French election this spring. In the meantime, a new far-right contender, Zemmour, has arisen and set off a furor for his anti-Muslim and sort of Platonist revisionism. So in France too, it does not look like the far right has necessarily grown more quiescent. In Austria, Sebastian Kurz fell because of corruption, and Golden Dawn was banned in Greece. But there are other far-right parties like Salvini's Lega in Italy that's remained strong. We still see anti-democratic leaders in Hungary, Poland, and elsewhere flexing their muscles. And this suggests that political extremism remains a potent threat in Europe. So we want to explore with three experts in the far right of Europe and illiberalism generally, how the far right seems to be benefiting from public opposition to these lockdowns and so on, and to also are influenced by conspiracy theories that have been circulating on social media about who's responsible for the pandemic at the same time. So let me introduce our three speakers for today. Mabel Berezin is professor of sociology and director of the Institute for European Studies at the Einaudi Center for International Studies at Cornell University. And she writes on challenges to democratic cohesion and solidarity in Europe and the United States. She is author of Illiberal Politics in Neoliberal Times and Making the Fascist Self, the Political Culture of Interwar Italy. And she's now working on a manuscript about the end of security and the rise of populism. So we look forward to hearing her thoughts on this subject, particularly about the rise of nationalism and the populist challenge to democracy. We also have Giovanni Savini, and we're going to go in this order. The presentations will be in this order. Giovanni Savini is a senior lecturer in history at the School of Public Policy in Moscow. He has worked on nationalism and the far right in Russia and Italy, and he's known for his work on Russian-Italian far right connections. And finally, Tommaso Vitali is Associate Professor of Sociology and I guess Directeur d'études in governing the large metropolis at Sciences Po in Paris. He's also a researcher in the Centre d'études européennes and a member of the Comité de Direction de l'Institut Convergence Migration. And he's coordinator of the research group Cities, Borders, and Immobility of the European Union community. He has published many books in urban sociology, but right now he's been working on right-wing mobilizations and Islamophobia, which is what we look forward to hearing from him about. And I'm Hilary Silver. I'm a sociologist, professor of sociology, international affairs, and public policy at George Washington University. I'm going to be your moderator. The way that we'll proceed is each presentation will be 10 to 15 minutes long. And after the three, we will just have quick responses of any of the speakers to one another. And then we'll open it up for questions. Please put your questions in the Q&A. So those of you who are listening at any time, you can put a Q&A question in the chat if you want, or the Q&A. Okay, and so let's get started with Mabel Berezin.
Okay, thank you. I want to thank Hilary Silver and her colleagues here at the Institute for European and Russian Studies for inviting me to participate and in this very timely discussion. And I'm going to actually give a kind of talk, so it'll have a beginning, middle, and end, and I'm going to have to work from my notes on it. And it's going to be, I think, somewhat more historical, perhaps, than what I anticipate the other speakers will do. So since I've been working on the European far right, which to my surprise has now been since 1998, I thought it was going to be a one-off project. I've always thought of myself as writing a history of the present. And I've always looked for turning points, trajectories, and of course, national context to understand and analyze what's going on. And I've also sort of been looking for an end of a story, not that history really ends, but there are periods and things change. And my question as I was thinking about the talk that I was asked to give here is, and I've been thinking about this for a while, are we at the end of a story and the beginning of a new one, or is it the same thing that's been going on for a while? So that's my overall question today. I'm going to talk about what I think may or may not be the political implications of the COVID pandemic, for both the future of the European far right and the EU and European democracy. And some of my examples would be from France, which I say I'm a little bit, I haven't been in Europe since COVID, and I feel the lack of actually being there, although I will be rectifying that in the spring. But anyway, let me just a quick thing with trajectory, because I thought I had 20 minutes and I see I have 10 to 15. So basically, a quick history of the European right. The far right has been around in some form or other since the end of World War II. They've always been outside the mainstream. Their status started to shift in the 1990s. This reached a kind of steady state in the year 2000s as they began to have breakthrough moments in elections, but began to change dramatically in 2015. I use 2015 and not 2016, where this sort of flowering of interest in populism occurred, because 2015 was the year of the triple crisis, the terror events in France, the austerity was still going on, and the refugee crisis. And it was after 2015 that you had a kind of flowering of populism, both in public perception and in actuality. Different parties, the Sweden Democrats is a good example of a breakthrough party, and Salvini in Italy in 2017, and the AfD gained traction, and the same old parties were there too, such as obviously Marine Le Pen in France. And Hungary and Poland. So it was quite an expansion of the landscape. Amusing to me was in the spring of 2017, Rachel Maddow actually talked about the Dutch parliamentary election, and the idea of an American, even a cable news station suddenly being worried about fascism or right-wingism in another country really suggested the perceptions, the sort of flood of perception about the right. Anyway, if you think of 2017 as the sort of one demarcation, 2019 was another one. It was in the spring of 2019, there was the European parliamentary elections. And during that time, both in the media and among governing elites, there was a virtual panic about that the far right in Europe would take over, they'd win the elections. The European Council of Foreign Relations were putting out policy documents that said how anti-Europeans plan to wreck Europe and what can be done to stop it. So there was quite a bit of drama there. In the end, it was an important election, but not because the right took over the European Parliament. 50% of Europeans actually came out to vote. This had been a number of people who vote in the number of people voting in the parliamentary elections it has gone way down since every year. The last time it reached 50% was in 1999. But in the end, the election results were not as spectacular as legislators had feared, but there were results. And I would argue that some of the results of that election are tendencies that we are living with today. The populist right did well, but they did not surge. So they sort of continued an entrenchment in the political landscape. And there was also in that election, I would argue, an increasing valorization of nationalism and national solutions and a pushback against European solutions. Not that this was new, but there was a sort of more of an affirmation of that. Green parties had a surprising uptick. They came third in Germany. And there was an implosion in that election of the traditional center left and center right parties. And most importantly, although it wasn't so obvious at the moment, it widened the political space in which extreme right groups such as the AfD in Germany could actually operate. And this was Europe, as it was, if you look at the entire landscape, until March 2020 and COVID. Now, events are crucial to resetting of historical trajectories. COVID should have been the tipping point event that radically shifted the fortunes of the European right, either for better or worse. And it also could have been the moment that affirmed Europe and EU as the location for European solutions to a truly global as well as European problem. A virus is a truly global actor, as well as an agent of social leveling. Viruses really do cross borders. You can't contain them. I'm going to argue actually that COVID did neither. It did not increase the fortunes of the right exactly, but I will get back to the extreme right that I know others are going to talk about here. Nor did it act as a vehicle for recommitment to a thick European community. This does not mean it had no effects upon European politics writ large, but rather than being transformative, exacerbated what was already there, but it wasn't a simple exacerbation. So I want to focus, the rest of my talk, I would just want to highlight, I'm not sure how I'm doing on time here, but three tendencies that we could see in the 2019 parliamentary elections and that COVID, I think, drew out in different ways. And I've sort of given my own labels to these tendencies. The first tendencies, I think, is what constituted the European right has shifted. That is, the landscape of grievances has changed. And I'm going to use a market metaphor here. I don't like them, but I think it works here. There basically became a sort of lack of product differentiation on the right side of the political spectrum. Nationalist values became more prevalent. The right lost its claim to them. And this is, I think, one of the issues that's tripping up Marine Le Pen right now, among other things in the upcoming presidential election. There has a recent study by actually a sort of neoliberal think tank in Paris called entitled The Conversion of Europeans to Right-Wing Values. It came out in May 2021. But what's interesting about it, the data in it, even if we might question the source, is that it actually shows a kind of shift across the political spectrum to being concerned with with basically immigration, social integration, all the things that I think Tommaso will talk about. And to a certain extent, I want to argue the official response to COVID, especially at the beginning, fed into nationalism, in that solutions were national, Sweden being the quintessential case, borders closed, as Hillary said. And in the spring of 2021, when nations were trying to distribute the vaccine, the EU stepped in and made dissemination worse. So none of this basically helped Europe. And if anything, it strengthened the argument for a national response. One more, again, market metaphor. I said there was product differentiation was sort of falling apart on the right, but it also, there's also been a question of what the product is. And I think the yellow vests in France, where people, before obviously 2019, but important, I won't talk about them now. Let me move on to the second tendency, and that is what I call the unexpected unmoorings. There might be a better word for that. 2022 is going to be a bellwether year in elections after the exogenous shock of COVID. And things are not going as analysts had thought that they would. Germany just happened, as we know. That didn't exactly turn out the way people thought it would. And the thing about Germany, people talked a lot about the AfD going from 17%, I believe, nationally to 11%, but that 11% is all in the former Eastern Europe. And it's also, there's a resurgence of COVID right now. And in that area where the AfD did well, the vaccination rate is like only 57%, the lowest in all of Germany. So Germany is behind us. The French presidential, the big one, is coming up in April. The unpopularity of Macron has been, is everyone knows that who looks at France. The seemingly disciplined position of Marine Le Pen, it all seems to be somewhat crumbling at the moment. The expectation had been that it would be Macron, Le Pen in the second round, but with closer margins than in 2017. But I think that hypothesis is gone. The regional elections this past June in France said, clearly showed where both of them did poorly, suggests a shift. The huge number of candidates that are actually running, I counted 23 this morning in the French presidential elections, suggests we might see 2002 again. And then, of course, Eric Zemmour didn't exactly come out of nowhere, but certainly has cut into Marine Le Pen's lead. So politics, the unmooring, let's just leave it that way. The third tendency, and I'm going to go a bit out on a limb here, but I know we're going to hear about this from other speakers, and that is, I would say, the changing nature of social movements. And in 2014, I actually wrote an article for Social Science and Medicine on the anti-vaxxers in the United States. And it was mainly about childhood vaccination. And the title of my article was called Risk is for the Rich. And you can sort of guess what that article was about from the title, and that it was kind of a lifestyle thing to protest vaccines. But that's shifted, I think. It's shifted in the United States. We know there's a lot of violence around anti-vax movements in the United States. I'm not going to belabor the anti-vax part of my talk because I know we're going to hear about that. But basically, in the United States, at least, the anti-vaxxers, the current anti-vaxxers, they're not the sort of, the people who sort of go to Whole Foods and only take organic, vitamins or something like that, which is what I found when we looked at the entire geography of the United States. These are a very different kind of anti-vaxxers, and they definitely come from the Trump experience. So certainly in the United States, the Trump experience has actually opened an outlet for radical politics around science. And I will leave it at that. Let me just move over to Europe. And again, I'm going out on a limb here, and I'm waiting to hear the actual talk on this. But one of the things that struck me seeing the anti-vax movement in Europe, which I was kind of surprised to see. It seemed to me a very typical American kind of thing, although I know that Europe has a history going back to smallpox and everything else of anti-vaccination. It seemed to me most, and again, I'm speaking out on a limb, most European protest is about social solidarity of some sort, even if it's the wrong kind of solidarity, like to say we're national and we don't like immigrants or something. And this kind of protest strikes me as almost much more individualized than one usually finds in a European context. And basically, it's obviously opened a space for all kinds of right-wing politicians to take advantage of it. And it also seems to me to open a space for the global far right to come together. So let me end. Those are my three tendencies. Where are we now? I said I've been always looking for the end of the story. I want to go back to the beginning of my talk. First of all, and what did COVID do for these various things I outlined? Institutionalized right, the people who actually run for things. Wobbly, but not gone, even if Marine Le Pen does not make it to the second round. And a real emergence of an extreme right as disruption, even if not elected. Certainly, probably Zemmour is not likely to be elected, and the AfD will see how they continue. The second thing, the European Union. I will not say it's on life support, but it does need to be more solution-oriented, beginning with austerity politics, sovereign debt, refugees, COVID, and vaccine distribution. It has to do better. Singing the ode to joy is getting tiresome. Lastly, European democracy. I put more faith in institutions than some of my colleagues, Hungary and Poland notwithstanding. And the political solution might lie in the resurgence of center-right parties that are national and support social issues. This is the argument put forth by Daniel Ziblatt in his book, Conservative Parties and the Birth of Democracy, and more people have been putting that argument forth. I used to end my talk on the rights talking about John Maynard Keynes when he talked about the dangers of the interwar period in Europe. But when I think of the events that were currently constructed, I think of another European, and that's Goethe, who quipped long ago, one never goes so far as one doesn't know where one is going. And I think to a certain extent, that's where we are. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mabel. I'm sorry for the technical difficulties, everyone. Our next speaker, are you ready?
Yes, ready?
Please, sorry, go right ahead.
Okay, so thank you for your invitation. I'm very glad to talk at your seminar. And my interest about COVID and about is connected with my interest with far right. Let's be clear, because studying far right in Russia and in Italy and their connections, the topic of COVID became a relevant story and in some way reshaped the landscape of political activity of far right in different forms, both in Italy and in Russia. I tried to explain about this on two papers, one for Journal of Illiberal Studies, the other one it was on the site of Illiberalism Studies, one devoted to Italy and the other one devoted to Russia. That in different conditions, in different environments for political and socio-economic issues, some of the main keywords used by far-right movements and anti-vaxxers are common. The most striking thing is that are common with the American anti-vaxxers, that this is the new big thing for the European and extra-EU context. And so let's come to Italy and let's start to see how it was the Italian political landscape at the end of 2019. At the end of 2019, there was a new government in Italy. After that, Matteo Salvini decided to break with the alliance that came out from the elections 1 year and a half before, because he was sure to get to new elections. Salvini League obtained at the European elections 34.6%, that it was a big record for his party, and he thought that it would be possible. But the pandemic changed all. Because yet if Salvini was in disgrace at the time, the possibility of achieving new elections and having a victory for the national populist agenda of the League and Fratelli d'Italia, Brothers of Italy, one of the main parties coming from the end of National Alliance, the former Italian social movement here in the 90s, were really high. The pandemic acted in this way, in a way of the current exchange of keywords and slogans from far right to the national populist far right and back. This is an interesting phenomenon. This is an interesting phenomenon that explains why some far-right organizations like Forza Nuova or Casa Pound performed really bad at the elections, but they are able to have a kind of hegemonic echo with the use of their rhetoric. And so when started the pandemic, and it was really, it was a very serious breakdown for Italy. The first slogans about pandemic were about the fake lab leak virus. That it was at the first spreaded with the use of the Russian social network Vkontakte, and then through Telegram and WhatsApp, and then later repressed by Salvini, that tweeted using a fake news that used some very old report by one local news TV news show about the origin of the virus after a leak in Wuhan. It was another coronavirus. We know that there are different coronavirus, but nevertheless, Salvini and then Giorgia Meloni, the leader of Brothers of Italy, used this news to bring out the idea that the virus was a kind of lab worked out. This is a big example of how national populist politicians worked in their rhetorics as spreading words and thoughts that are coming from the far right. But the far right didn't lose time. At the end of during April 2020, Forza Nuova, this ultra-Catholic neo-fascist movement founded in 1997 by Roberto Fiore, a former leader of the Italian third position that went in escape to London in the 80s and hid not really, there, tried to organize meetings and demos against the lockdown measures. For example, here we can see a poster. They tried to organize a Catholic Easter in the streets of Rome, in contraposition with the policy of the Catholic Church at that moment, that it was about respecting the fact that there was a pandemic. At this moment started the idea of sanitary dictatorship. The first one that used were the guys around Forza Nuova. But Salvini, when there were the discussion about the European Solidarity Fund that later became the ESM, talked about the European sanitarian dictatorship, and in this way retweeted by many of these actors. After that, there was an attempt by really another neo-fascist organization, Casa Pound, to organize the movement of Mascherine Tricolori, the tricolor masks that tried to organize demos every Saturday with virtually no success, except one demo at the end of April 2020 in Rome. And here, this is about the tweet made by Salvini and Giorgia Meloni about the lab leaks. The lab leak theory. That is about how they came out as the main spreader of hoax and fake news on this period. Together with this, Salvini was not only to talk about sanitary dictatorship, There was an Italian thinker, one of the most important Italian philosopher, Giorgio Agamben, that talked about sanitary dictatorship, despotism. Still today, he is really active against the Italian green card, that in Italian it is called the Green Pass, about the vaccination. And words coming from Agamben works on pandemics were highly published and then underlined by far-right and national populist newspapers and media. This is an example from La Verità, that is one of the main newspapers of the national populist area, with a big interview to Agamben. After that, there were other 5 interviews. There was a really hagiographic, I will say, review of his book on COVID, that is called In Which Point We Are, Pandemics as Politics. And this is about the Great Convergence, trying to find arguments that were able to bring all the people together in a united front against the new pandemic political reality. Here we had 2 other traditional kind of conspiracy theory activists. One of these is this guy dressed in an orange vest that is called Antonio Pappalardo, a former general of the Italian Carabinieri. He is famous for having organized different, quite between the extreme and the freak political spectrum activities, where he started to find out that there was no COVID. He stated that COVID is just a simple flu, that it is possible to be cured with yoga. Pappalardo is not the only one. There is a small but really vocal new age area in Italy that is trying to do. And for the far right, this was not a so strange ambient. Why? Italian far right ideologically is still connected with the teachings of Julius Evola, that was the ideal father of the neo-fascism after the Second World War. In some way, he introduced many topics of German National Socialism and paganism in the Italian neo-fascism. And this idea about New Age and the idea that it is possible to cure COVID with homeopathic measures or with yoga or with transcendental meditation are not just freaky things, but they are common because there is a kind of heritage by the far right in realizing this kind of thing. And the far right tried, after a hiatus in summer 2020, to organize more and more some of the protests that erupted in Italy. Here, there were protests in Italy. These protests were led usually by small businessmen, by small cafe and restaurant proprietors, owners, and so on. Many of them at the beginning were quite confused, had different people taking part to them, but from the very beginning of November 2020, they became clearer and clearer on far right. Here we have on this picture, on this selfie, the guy with the white shirt is Giuliano Castellino, that is one of the main leaders of Forza Nuova in Italy. And the other one is the leader of the movement called Io Apro, I Open. This was a movement organized by small restaurant owners to reopen their activities against the decrees and against the demands made by the Italian Council of Ministers during the second wave in fall and winter 2020-2021. And they went farther and farther on the right. They went so farther on the right that at one moment there was an attempt to organize a united front, a party that had to fight against the sanitary dictatorship. This party was made by General Pappalardo Orange Vest, Forza Nuova, other New Age activists, but at the from the very beginning, this party split out in different formations. Here you can see that the symbolic is quite strange because it's the Van de heart that here it is recalling as maybe an anti-enlightenment rhetoric, so more clear and traditionalist in this way. But together with this, there is another party that was organized during this time. This party had a rebranding. It is called the 3V. In Italian is Vaccini vogliamo verità. Vaccine, we want truth. This party is more similar to traditional anti-vaxxers organization in the US, and has a member of parliament, Sara Cunhal, that was expelled by the Five-Star Movement last year. But this party is seeing himself not as a kind of political party or a party on far left or far right positions, but a kind of focus group against vaccination. At the last town and city elections this fall, this party had some success in some little realities, like the city of Trieste, I will talk about this at the end, and the city of Rimini. And here, if the main protest during all 2020 was against masks, against the online education, and against the preventive measures, from the beginning of the vaccination campaign, protests were against vaccines and went more radical. Here, the issue was noi siamo il popolo. We are the people. In some way, here coping the German anti-vaxxer movement. On the other hand, the real idea was not of bringing many political issues, but using Forza Nuova as the main organizer of the protest. For example, all the meetings organized in spring, summer, and fall 2021 were requested. In Italy, you have to request the authorization for organizing a meeting by representatives of Forza Nuova. The meeting here, that it was the last big one on October 9, that ended with the assault to the Confederation of the Italian Trade Unions, the CGL, by a mob, was requested by the guy here, Giuliano Castellino, that is a famous, as I said, Forza Nuova leader, and famous for having years of arrest, having a very long penal career on this. The Green Pass here is the last convergence. Giorgia Gamben promoted with another renewed philosopher, Massimo Cacciari. Today is more than a philosopher, is a kind of TV opinionist, an appeal against the measure of using the green card for access to university, to the work, and in other issues. This call was reached by far-right activists and by other kind of activists. And this protest went really viral in Trieste. This little city in the northeastern part of Italy had for days a mobilization by a part of dock workers calling against the Green Pass and trying to have an effect. But here, there is a fact in this front that is interesting for one thing. The fact that this broader coalition is so broader that has always splitting fights inside them, and they are not able to organize a political proposal, but they are able to have a toxic narrative. And the toxic narrative here is about anti-Semitism and the connection of anti-vaxxer people, connecting here with the history of the Holocaust and the Shoah. Here we have some pictures. Here, the first one is a post on Facebook by a league candidate at Turin administrative election. Here he took a picture from Auschwitz camp and he made out vaccine makes you free. The other one is a demo in Milan in where is used the yellow star stating no, not vaccinated. And the last one is in Novara, a small town between Milan and Turin, in which the anti-vaxxers used the forms of former prisoners of war and deported people in Nazi lagers for claiming their sort of this. There was a study that only in 2020, thousands of anti-Semitic posts that made out that the virus was created by conspiration by George Soros, Bill Gates, and the Rothschild. And this narrative is present too in the Russian far right, but for Russian far right, anti-Semitism is nothing new. Had more than 10,000 interactions. There are for now not research about 2021, but with the introduction of Green Pass, it is possible just visually to find out how the comparison with what happened in Europe in the 40s is used by anti-vaxxers to move out their discourse. And the assault on CGL is interesting for this thing. They were assaulting a trade union confederacy in Italy is something new. It didn't happen in the last 100 years. The last time that it happened, it was during the period of fascism. And the assault on CGL was led by Forza Nuova mobsters like Roberto Fiore and Giuliano Castellino. After that, the fact that this trade union was assaulted, and after it was organized 1 week after a big demo in Rome in solidarity with this union, is the fact of using some topics, traditionals, to the far-right rhetorics against trade unions, against the sexual, national, religious minorities considered to be responsible of pandemic closures and so on, and a great growth of anti-scientific, anti-enlightenment prejudice used for bringing this front to a kind of political result. If I'm quite sure that there will be no political union between these forces, because there are historical and practical reasons for this, the main fact is about the keywords and about the ideas that they are promoting, that they are permitting not only their area, but the national populist area, and they are so permitting a part of the Italian society. But in Italy today, 73% of the population had 2 shots of vaccination. So it seems that still the area to whom they are appealing these forces is still a minority area. But we have to be clear about this and to analyze how this new reshaping of far-right rhetoric will have an effect, especially for the nature of national populist forces of siphoning these keywords and these slogans on the public opinion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Giovanni. That was scary, very scary. But thank you for the details. It's really scary. And now we have someone else who knows Italy very well as well, Tommaso Vitali.
Thank you very much, Hilary. Thanks to everyone for for inviting me and for this important conversation. So I will try maybe to restructure my intervention to enter into a dialogue with the two previous ones. Because, you know, in academic literature, Italy has been referred to as the promised land of, or a breeding ground for populism, because of the sustained success of far-right populist parties, and especially the Lega Nord that emerged in 1980s, and the new success of this political party called Brothers of Italy. And I guess that compared to what Giovanni and Mabel said, I would like to focus a little bit less on extreme right-wing movements like Forza Nuova or the really extremely right-wing mobilizations, and look at the electoral success of the far-right parties. Obviously, the far-right parties have been affected by the COVID, especially in Italy. But if we take together the two big far-right parties, Italian Brothers and the League, no significant change in their support can be observed in Italy between January 2020 and today. However, a significant change in support can be observed for these two political parties at the non-aggregate level. So voter support for League has been gradually declining from 32% on January the 1st, 2020 to 19% last week, while support for the Italian Brothers has risen from 11 to 20% during this period. And I mean that the overall number of people looking at the far right is stable at 40% of the Italian population. And it's the internal logic between a party like the League that is nativist, and it is nativist, and it is xenophobic, but it is within the government, together with the Draghi and a large coalition of political parties, and a party which is nativist, authoritarian, and xenophobic, and populist, like Italian Brothers, that is at the opposition, and who is classically winning a bit from being at the opposition. But we see flows of consensus and support from one to the other. We don't see a major capacity to attract. So, point number two, it seems to me that it's very important to say that COVID could be interpreted as a catalyst and not as a cause of far-right spreading. Let's look at the French case. In the French case, we have a traditional, strong far-right party, Front National, that has changed of name, but remains the legacy of Mr. Le Pen. His party is present at the presidential election since a long time. and it is challenged at the far right from a new leader, the far right populist, nativist Eric Zemmour, a sort of media broadcasting intellectual, highly inspired by the former tradition of anti-Islamic intellectuals, especially Fallaci, that is very present, is very sexy and appealing, and it is challenging the electorate of the Front National, of the Rassemblement National, as we call it today, but maybe attracting a little bit of new voters, but not massive new voters. We will see. It is early, but it seems to me that also if we introduce the case of Vox in Spain, what is important is this idea, in my judgment, that the crisis pushing toward a massive race of nativist, far-right, populist parties has started well before the COVID. It's a crisis in, firstly, political communication. Secondly, in the relationship between, let's say, ordinary knowledge and technical knowledge of expertise. Thirdly, political efficacy in steering social policies, and especially active labor market policies. And fourthly, it's a crisis in the relationship with, and I guess that Giovanni was absolutely right, with the Enlightenment. And I guess that Mabel talked about this long history of problems in relating to some forms of cold knowledge of frameworks in addressing the problems of collective goods, the problems of development, and so on. This crisis in political communication, in the relation to the knowledge of expertise, in the relation with science, and with the capacity of government to steer employment policies, social policies, protective policies, social security policies, is very long. The language that has been developed, especially by radical thinkers, geographers, and so on, addressing these problems in terms of neoliberalism, is at the same time correct and very poor, because it tends to level many different levels of analysis, and especially to consider that issue of privatization and problems in the way of financing public policy has been the principal cause of a sort of massive transformation of societies. But I guess that there are other issues that we see that are very relevant and that are partially independent from any kind of privatization and neoliberalism. The spreading of nativist argument among the population, as Giovanni said, coming from extreme, small, far-right groups and little parties and little movements, has been able, through a magnificent use of communication and new media, to influence large part of the populations. This strong 40% of the Italian voters, of the Italian citizens that look at some forms of far-right representation, political representation, tell us something about how these changes have been able to influence attitudes, values, and also feelings of disenfranchisement, of fear. It seems to me that what is important to recognize looking at the COVID is that probably with some notable exceptions, far-right parties were, let's say, at the beginning, not very active in proposing strong solutions to cope with the crisis. They were trying to invest the sphere of political communication with their kind of, let's say, neo-pagan elements, looking for solutions that could be different from the mainstreaming ones, looking at some kind of conspiracy theory. But these far-right parties were also in charge of governing some of the regions or some of the cities affected, and they were not able to go too much further in this kind of, let's say, conspiracy frame. So, in a way, they have left many room to extreme right-wing movements to play this role around conspiracy theory, neo-pagan elements, and anti-enlightenment rhetorics. And they have, in a way, make a step back from strong direct mobilizations. They were present, they were tweeting, but they were not the, let's say, the engine of this mobilization. So I guess that my main point is that for many reasons coming before COVID, far-right movements, they have grown a lot. They were able to attract a lot of support. They became not hegemonic, but highly influent among maybe not half of the population, but a very large representation of this population. But the COVID has not magnified their power. On the contrary, COVID has left room for the spreading and the empowerment of extreme right-wing movement, not just far-right parties. My last point is that the narratives of far-right parties were largely in line with their ideological core, particularly with their nativism. So they were very happy when there has been a national lockdown, a national closure of the borders, some kind of fear towards strangers. But at the same time, they were really at the core of the mainstream of how in every country there has been a political treatment of the pandemics. They were not very much able to differentiate their positions. they haven't lost consensus. They weren't able to won much more consensus. Facing these situations, some scholars, some also opinionists, predicts that Europe is awaiting something much worse than the populist right of the 2010s. Something like an extreme right using the whole arsenal of the Red Scare and right-wing authoritarianism to intimidate opponents and defend its interests from demands for meaningful economic redistribution. I think that this interpretation is not correct, even if all the violent mobilizations, all the capacity to mobilize around protest against the COVID pass, the so-called green pass or health pass, the capacity to mobilize against masks, against vaccinations, against any form of systematic knowledge coming from mainstream science is important, but I don't think we will assist to this kind of extreme nightmare. I'm much more, let's say, I'm much more prone to think that there will be much more capacity to influence ideas coming from the fringe, and that in a way a sort of there will be at the same time probably some kind of ambivalent process with massive criticism against extreme right-wing ideas and conspiracy theories from a large majority of the population, not only intellectuals. And at the same time, the increasing of a culture of doubts, a culture of challenge towards traditional scientific paradigm, and a sort of new legitimacy for neo-pagan elements. I don't think that the aversion to the vaccine or the hostility towards the pass will make possible the rise of a very large post-fascist right-wing movements. But I think that there will be much more room for maneuver for them to develop intellectual and political attractiveness. So it seems to me that the COVID as a catalyst has enforced them, not in terms of consensus and large support, but in terms of their repertoires of action, in terms of their intellectual framing, in terms of their capacity to transmit from the old generation to the new militants some not only keywords, but the whole ideology. And this will open a new moment, a moment in which they will engage and mobilize in the next years with more resources, more commitment. COVID has not made them winning elections, but they have made them stronger. That's my interpretation.
Thank you very much, Tommaso. Here again, I suppose you have given us a little bit of a little bit of hope to think that this won't completely undermine democracy.
I gave you.
But I do think, I mean, certainly all of you have pointed out that that COVID has destabilized security with respect to the establishment, Enlightenment ideas, science, rationality, and the like, and certainly has made an opening in mass publics for a great deal of fear and emotional responses to what's going on, so that politics is less, people are responding perhaps less to interests and much more to feelings. At least it sounds this way to me. I want to give Mabel and Giovanni an opportunity to respond to one another before I open it up for questions. I'm hoping that there will be some questions. Meanwhile, please put them in the chat or do we have a Q&A? I don't see a Q&A. So I guess please put your questions in the chat. Go ahead, Mabel.
I thought my talk was very similar to Tommaso's. Can people hear me? Because I don't see any.
Yes.
On my,
Yes, very well.
yeah, I mean, because I hope I didn't convey that I thought we were on the verge of a neo-fascist revolution in Europe. And anything I said, it's a center-right is where I think we're going to maybe end up. But two things. I guess one thing, I will say one thing about France, even though I haven't been there in a couple of years. And that is, I mean, I do think that this idea of, one of the things I've argued from the minute I started this project now, it's not one project, but when I started looking at this 20 years ago, was that I actually see the European Union and its, let me just say ineptitude, since I'm assuming we don't have any EU scholars here that are going to chop my head off, but basically that this has really been pushing in many ways the nationalist predispositions in Europe, and that this is one of the points where people like Le Pen, when she was trying to moderate what her father was saying, where she was gaining some traction. It's not such an odd thing to argue with ordinary people for national solutions. And what I do think, I don't think Zemmour is going to win the presidency of France, but when I actually looked, before he even came on the scene, and I saw all these people that were running, and you all know that France has this two-tier system, and you know what happened in 2002, it just struck me that, something weird can happen again in the first round. But we don't, that's all I'm going to say at the moment. And he certainly, put I don't know what he certainly, what would you say when somebody messes with, expectations? I don't know. I can't think of a good metaphor for what, even if he takes 1% or 2%, as Tommaso says, none of them are going to run the country for sure. But that actually leads me to my second point, and that is the Italian situation. Which I think is really interesting in many ways. And I really enjoyed looking at all the slides. I've always sort of thought about Italy since I studied fascism, since I spent time in the country, as kind of an odd kind of outlier. And I was struck by all the different Italian cultural tropes. There was the Catholic thing in one part. And it's interesting to me because also in the Italian case, I don't expect any of these kinds of people that Giovanni put up on the screen necessarily be running Italy anytime soon, but Italian politics has been such a minestrone of different kinds of people that, it's sort of, I always used to sort of feel like, how do you talk about this? Because you never know what's going to happen next. Although the same threads are always there. So the one thing that struck me about the Italian case is I've always argued that in contrast to someplace like France, Italy, even today, even after fascism, even after, the 1950s and everything, it has still been one of the least nationally cohesive nation states in Europe. And there's this intense regionalism in Italy. That you can be in the north and somebody will say one thing to you and you go to the south, they'll say something else. And one of the things that struck me is interesting, or a thought that came to me, is that this kind of thing could push a cohesive Italian nationalist discourse into the mainstream of Italy. Now, I don't know if that's possible, but I would be really interested. I mean, it's an empirical question. But even in those slides that you saw, I didn't see like one Italy anywhere either. I just saw a lot of sort of outliers, violent outliers in some instances, and I actually saw more American influence there. And I need to think about that than I expected to see. But they seem to be more in line with our anti-vaxxers. I don't want to take up any more time because I know people want to speak, but these are the kinds of thoughts that both of you generated in different ways. So.
Thank you. I have to say that in some ways, the idea that these should become win a majority perhaps is more far-fetched than that they do influence the nature of public discourse and pushes it towards the extreme new issues that arise and so on. Giovanni, do you want to?
Yes, I will add just something because I agree with what Tommaso and Mabel said. And here the issue is clear. We are not talking about for now of a majority. I'm stating for now, not because I'm thinking that Pappalardo will be the next president of Italian Republic. I think that this will be quite impossible. The real issue here is the construction of a kind of an anti-scientific, anti-enlightenment awareness in many layers of the population. And sometimes here this cross is not going on left and right coordinates. This is an important issue. And I really don't, for now, I have no answers about this. I think that this is not just an Italian process. I think that this is an European process. I think that in some way, Eastern European countries, for some historical reasons, are far away on this way. I quoted about Russia, but I have no time. But here, the issue is that in Russia, we have from 30 to 40% of convinced anti-vaxxers. That this is a big difference with Italy or France or Germany. And the fact that national populist rhetorics, it's true that this rhetoric is going radicalized in the last years. But the main issue here is how COVID led to a further radicalization, to a further loss of expertise. Because usually, there were always flirting with medicine. In the Italian case, for example, at the end of the 90s, the former National Alliance promoted a kind of anti-cancer cure promoted by an old doctor called Luigi Di Bella. But still, the fact that here is so affirmed, and here there is the public responsibility and social responsibility of media that are coming with one anti-vaxxer and one pro-vax speaker at every talk show, it is consolidating this kind of anti-scientific discourse that sometimes is not current at all. Canon is not alone about this, because this kind of anti-current discourse, some days ago, I was at host in one Italian talk show that it was really scary, more scary than my slides. And before me, there was this European MP, Francesca Donato, that is an European MP of the League, that talked against vaccination, stating in 1 minute things that were, COVID is a flu, but doctors knows how to cure COVID with alternative cure, and vaccination is spreading COVID. So you can understand that on logic, these are three contradictory affirmations. But here is not speaking Roberto Fiore, is speaking an European MP. This is a big problem. And I'm agree that the fact that Italy is not a cohesive country is true. In some way, I think that in some way this is a luck more than issue. And there are a difference. I didn't speak about this, about regional difference about the perception of vaccine and the rhythm of vaccination. This will be interesting in terms of sociology, in regional sociology, to find out about this. But the fact that there is a polarization and the construction of an affirmative, aggressive, anti-scientific discourse, this is the main legacy of all this period. And this is the main fact that is scary, not the fact that tomorrow Forza Nuova will be at the government. It will be impossible, but anti-scientific legacy could be lost.
True, but all of these anti-scientific, you can oppose expertise, but also to start to attribute new conspiracies and different agents responsible in nefarious causes. This reflects a great deal of uncertainty and fear on the part of these populations, that there's a hole in our leadership, in the existing party structure, to take these kinds of problems in charge and to reassure the population that somebody knows what they're doing. So there is a bit of that. Tommaso, did you want to say anything more before I open it to the audience?
Yeah, I fully agree with the points raised. I just want to add another point, which is the fact that it's the relationship between these far-right parties and the EU membership. Because at the very beginning of the pandemic in Europe, Vox, the Rassemblement National in France, as well as the League and Italian brothers, they really hit against the EU, saying that the European Union has abandoned their country in the face of the COVID pandemic. As usual, Salvini, with his colorful language, is the one that we can quote, because Salvini accused the EU of being nothing more than, if I remember well, a lair of serpents and jackals. But beyond the colorful language, there was a specific political point of these far-right movements that was trying to represent some kind of national interest, except that they were not able to lead the negotiations. And that when the European Union decided one of probably the largest recovery plan has ever thought about, and has granted a lot of money for the recovery of South European countries, these far-right parties simply lose their room for maneuver for fighting against. So they were in a situation where borders were strictly closed, where European Union was sustaining and financing, where there was a state using its strength and its authority in an almost authoritarian sense. So everything, whatever it was, the topic, the policy style, and so on, there was no room for maneuver for them to be critical.
Yeah, this is
so
very
they moved towards freedom, and they have highly invested this kind of legacy of something anarchist in the far right, freedom, extreme individualism. And it's an important point. This way of investing the freedom of not being vaccinated, not being controlled, not being, and so on, is strictly related to the fact that other traditional policy fields were already covered by the action of states and the European Union.
So it was a process of elimination. They went libertarian because they didn't have anywhere else to go. Okay, I see. That's a very interesting point. There is a question from my co-organizer that I'd like to get in before we end in 10 minutes. I'd like to introduce you to Catherine Kleppinger, who teaches French studies at GW. And she has a question for you.
Hi, oh, thank you so much. No, I really appreciated this, and thanks again for all of your really insightful comments. So, you know, what strikes me as I was thinking about what you were saying was, I know that Mabel, you noticed, or you kind of cited this already, the interesting parallel between many of these movements and what we see in the United States. And I was also thinking about France and the kind of unusual correspondence we see between some of these far-right conversations. But what I was wondering for all three of you is, you know, how much do we know? I know this might be somewhat speculation, but how much do we know about communication among these groups? You know, to what extent is the French case, you know, talking to Italians, talking to Germans, you know, do we, other than sort of interesting parallels that we can see from a distance, do we know anything more about how much they're actually communicating with each other?
I have a very quick answer. So the leader of Italian Brothers, Meloni, a woman, was 3 days ago in Spain, invited by Vox. And both Salvini and Meloni have developed relations with Steve Bannon. And when Salvini launched the biggest campaign for the national election, he was the only leader in Italy organizing a European-wide event. So in the main square of Milan, he invited all the leaders of all far-right parties from Europe, from the Eastern Europe, as well as from continental, South and Mediterranean Europe. And so they are connected, they exchange, they compete at the European level for money. They have very different policy position related to forms of policy making, but they exchange a lot in terms of campaigning, political communication, issue of nativism, border controls. So then there are extreme right movements that they train together, but also in terms of these far-right large parties, they have not only a day-by-day dialogue, but they have a political capacity to make coalitions, to be visible together.
You know, I want to say something about it too. In 2017, they both, I'm looking at the chat there. There was a very conscious attempt to have public meetings. They are aware of themselves. They did have Bannon in. I don't know if they brought Bannon back, because Bannon tried to do something in Italy. He tried to have some training school for right-wingers in some church he bought. I can't remember the details now. It didn't work out very well. The Italian government somebody got rid of him. But there was some tax issue. So they do talk to each other. Marine Le Pen just recently went to Hungary, and they like to be seen with other sort of right wingers. What it means, I'm sure they're communicating. But one thing that people don't look at, there was this group, and this is where the nationalism issue comes in. There was a more sort of, I don't know how to put it, sort of softer right-wingism. There was a group called the National Conservatives, and they had their first meetings in, I believe, in the summer of 2019. And it was a group, it was an attempt to get together, not the sort of Marine Le Pen types, but although her niece did go to this thing, and they would meet twice a year, both in the United States and somewhere in Europe. And they had a sort of more intellectual group of people that went. And they were going to have their third meeting in Rome in 2020, just when COVID hit. And I don't think they didn't have it. And they've sort of reconstituted itself. And they met about 2 weeks ago actually in Florida in the United States. And when I looked at the people who actually went to it, they didn't have any. I didn't see any Europeans of the intellectual sort or otherwise. They have people like Josh Hawley in the United States that went both to the first one and the next one. And I'm actually somewhat even almost more concerned about those kind of groups, even though they don't disseminate information as well as Tommaso has pointed out that these other groups do, because they're actually sort of using their brain power to sort of think through things in a way that Bannon isn't. I mean, Bannon has his virtues if you want to be a right-wing leader, but Bannon is too easy to sort of shunt aside, whereas these people are a little bit more seductive in the seeming moderation of their language. So yes, they do communicate, to answer to your short point.
I will add that, yes, they communicated not only on this point between leaders, there are informal communications, and there is two other places in which they are communicating. For example, for all the world far right, the World Family Congress is one of these examples. And here with the active participation of Russian Orthodox and nationalist leaders and organization. And about this, it was interesting that the last big attempt to build what was called a Black International, of course, journalists here are doing something like this. It was the attempt made by the Orthodox oligarch, the Russian Konstantin Malafiev, with the meeting 7 years ago for the 200 years of the Holy Alliance in Vienna, with different stakeholders of the far right in Europe, with people near to the National Front, to the League, and so on. So yes, there are communication, but I don't think that there is a kind of more detailed strategy. They have connections, yes, but they are just adapting in every country their strategies. And I think that this is quite obvious on this way.
Wow. Okay. Well, unfortunately, I thank you for that question, Catherine. It really was informative. I also had in mind this idea, just as we talked about the role of the European Union as being sort of a target of all these nationalists. It's also the case that they talk a good line about being anti-globalist, but we see quite a bit of globalism on the part of the far right as well. So there's both going on there. I want to thank you very much. We're at the end of our hour and a half, and I do apologize for the technical problems at the beginning. But let me turn on my video before I'm going to run out of charge on my laptop on top of everything else. I want to thank everybody for coming. If you have any additional questions, if you would put them, those of you who are in attendance, if you would put them in the chat, I can forward them along, or the speakers can certainly respond to you by email. So please do, if you have any further questions, put them in the chat with your email, and I think the speakers would be glad to get back to you on it since we're at 12:30. I really want to thank all of you. I learned a real lot about Italy today. Since I work on France and Germany, this has been very informative. You know, it's a little bit scary, and I'm really hoping that the vaccine, I mean, there's a new surge in Germany, a fourth wave of COVID right now in Germany when I'm getting ready to go there. A little worried, but I'm hoping that now that so many people are vaccinated, that this sleeping lion that's always been there will sort of crawl back underground, and we'll go back to some normal politics, but we never know. Thank you once again for being in touch, with us today. We will have a similar kind of event in the spring dealing with the French presidential elections. We've done the German elections earlier this semester, but we will be having another event on the French elections coming in the run-up to the French elections. And I hope I get a chance to see you, Tommaso, on the other side of the Atlantic. And
Yeah.
please, yeah. And Mabel, you're coming to Europe as well next semester?
Well, next semester, yes. I need to go back to Europe, so I will. Yes. I'm not teaching next semester, so.
Super. Well, maybe I'll also see you while I'm in Germany and see you somewhere in Europe as well.
Now I have to go to Italy, though, clearly. And Italy was my last trip out of the country before COVID came. So.
Well, that's great. Now they've opened up. Today's the first day that Europeans can come to the United States. So hopefully this will start to get normal again. And Giovanni, it was nice to meet you for the first time. Are you in Russia now or in Italy?
Yes, I'm in Russia. I'm kind of hostage of Russian Federation for now, for all this COVID story. But yesterday, I see it was approved by the Italian health minister that it is possible to get a reboost there with Pfizer or Moderna, because now Sputnik is not acknowledged by the EMA, so I had to be here.
Be careful. Yeah, get your vaccine.
I vaccinated with the Russian one, but I didn't become a Putin fan or something like that, so it's okay.
Well, I hope you'll all be safe. Thank you so much again for joining us this different hours and so on.
Sure.
And Mabel, I'll see you on Facebook.
Thank you, though. Thank you.
Thanks very much for joining us. I don't see any questions in the chat, but so we'll just give one more second to see if there will be any. Tariq asks Tommaso if you've seen any connections between, I guess, Russian and far-right group. So Tariq had a question for you, Tommaso. So
I guess that Giovanni is much more expert than me, considering the connection in the far right and the extreme right between Russia and Italy. I just say that Italy, especially northern Italy, has traditionally a lot of economic exchange with Russia. Okay, so if you go to do ski on the Alps, I don't know, in Switzerland or in France, you have advices in French and in English, or in German, or at least in Flemish. If you go to do ski on the Alps in Italy, also in the Lombardy region, you have advices, you know, at the restaurant or in the shops in Russian. So there are networks of relationship between middle-sized enterprises in Russia and in Italy. If you go on the beach in the middle of Italy, you will find hotels that are with, you know, servants able to enjoy a conversation in Russian, or at least say good morning and good night in Russian. There are